Hello, and welcome to the TennisWorthy podcast, brought to you by the International Tennis Hall of Fame. I'm Patrick McEnroe, and our theme for this month is boldness. We often celebrate the superstars who started at a great disadvantage, but how often do we think about how bold they had to be, even to get to a level where they could challenge for the top titles? That's a part of many athletes' success that so often flies under the radar. So in this podcast, we're linking our theme of boldness with Black History Month and taking a look at 3 African-American tennis legends and how they demonstrated boldness in some aspect of their careers. Chris Bowers looks at the iconic stories of Arthur Ashe and Althea Gibson, as well as the mentor who did so much to shape them, Robert Johnson. Let's send you over to Chris.
Anyone growing up in today's tennis world, even allowing for residual inequalities, would be horrified at the world in which Althea Gibson played tennis as a teenager. Born in 1927 in South Carolina, she rose to prominence through the American Tennis Association, the federation specifically catering for black tennis players in the 1940s and 50s, an era in which tennis was openly segregated. 3 years after winning the ATA women's singles, Gibson was still not allowed to compete in events run by the USLTA, the body responsible for white tennis players. But in 1950, Gibson profited from an act of boldness from Alice Marble, a former Wimbledon and US champion from the late 1930s, as Gibson explained to Bud Lesser in this interview from 1979.
Alice Marble wrote an open letter to me, and of course copies were sent to officials of the USLTA, ATA, and the press. And she was appalled at the fact that I had to go through so much of this rigmarole to permit me to play in USLTA events.
And this, of course, was all color discrimination.
Yes. I don't know at that time what the reasons. Maybe they thought that I wasn't good enough, but I soon disproved, that, or proved that I was good enough and became a great champion. And so I was entered after all of these meetings, and I don't remember how long it took. I entered in the USLTA Eastern Indoor Championship at the 369th Regiment Armory, 143rd Street off of 5th Avenue, and I won that. After winning that, I was invited to participate in the National Indoor Championships at the 66th Street Armory on Park Avenue. And I played in that for 2 years. I didn't win that one. But I think my record showed that I was ready to get into so-called big-time tennis, amateur tennis in those days. And thereafter, I was invited to play in as many tournaments as I wished to enter.
Marble's intervention shifted opinions, and Gibson was able to enter the US Nationals, the forerunner of today's US Open, in 1950. And while she lost in the second round, her sheer presence caused such international media interest that the climate began to change. Allowed to play an unrestricted schedule, Gibson's rise continued, yet her ascent to the summit was far from guaranteed. And it was a bold move in early 1955 that laid the foundations for her 3 glory years of 56, 57 and 58.
I had just finished teaching at Lincoln University. I was assistant instructor in the Department of Health and Physical Education. And I was getting a little weary of being an instructor at that time. And I was trying to determine what I wanted to do with my life. I wasn't playing as much tennis as I wished to because I felt at that time that you had to work to make a living. And of course, I couldn't make a living playing amateur tennis, and I didn't have the sponsorship that the players have today. So I was approached by officials from the State Department and the USLTA to go on a Goodwill State Department tour throughout Southeast Asia. And the other players would be Carol Fageros and Bob Perry and Hamilton Richardson, who was selected as the captain of the team. So we traveled to Southeast Asia, and our first stop was Rangoon, Burma. And we played exhibitions and gave demonstrations and attended all the social affairs. And the first tournament that they had while we were over there was the All Asian Championship in Calcutta, or whether it was the All Indian, I don't know. I don't remember. But I do know that every single tournament that they held during our stay in Southeast Asia, I won every single one of them. And it was from this experience that I believe that my tennis rise had begun. Championship form was beginning. And during that time, from the time I went to Southeast Asia and throughout Europe after that tour, up to the French Championship in 1956, I had won over 17 straight tournaments in a row.
In just 3 years, Gibson won 11 major titles, 5 of them in singles, Roland Garros in 56 and the Wimbledon and US titles in 57 and 58. And she helped the USA win the annual Great Britain versus America Whiteman Cup competition in 1957. She was runner-up in the Australian Nationals that year too, and it's worth noting another bold move. Her Wimbledon doubles title in 56 with Angela Buxton, the partnership of a black woman and a Jew, which also did a lot to shake up the single ethnicity of tennis. Althea Gibson was the undisputed world number one, and a charismatic one, but women's tennis was all amateur, and Gibson came from modest surroundings. She needed to monetize her tennis skills, which in 1959 involved quitting the tour and becoming a warm-up act for the legendary basketball show team, the Harlem Globetrotters.
The Harlem Globetrotters, as you know, great basketball entertainment team. Abe Saperstein, the owner, we got together and was offered a contract to be one of the Harlem Globetrotters shows on the tour. We would open the show every night with the 8-game pro set. In other words, the player that won 8 games wins the match. That was our part as a part of the Harlem Globetrotters show. But I had to, because I was getting paid for this, I had to turn pro. So we were on tour with the Harlem Globetrotters from 59 to 60. I think the tour ended for us in the United States in April. That same month after we got back, I think they had the indoor professional championship in Cleveland. It was the Cleveland Arena. And I think at that time it was sponsored by by Pepsi-Cola. And I beat Pauline Betts-Addy in the finals of that professional championship. Now, here I was, a professional champion of the world, so-called, and there were no professional tournaments for me to play in. So, what could I do? So I've decided that at that time, since I was a professional tennis player, there were no professional tournaments for me to participate in, and I had to make a living. I had to earn money to live. I then decided that I would give professional golf a fling, because professional golf for the women at the time was coming, and we're playing for, purses, but the purses were very, very small.
But a little better than tennis.
Well, much better than tennis at the time, because during my reign, it was strictly amateur. I perhaps could have been a champion for many years, even after 58, after I defended my title at Wimbledon. But because of those days, it was strictly amateur, and I couldn't, didn't have a sponsor, and so I couldn't.
If it had been open championships in those days, you would have stayed active much longer.
I probably would have been champion for maybe 5, 6, 7 years. Who knows?
Despite being the first black player to compete on the women's professional golf tour, her successes in golf were limited. But in 1971, the tennis community recognised her significant role in the history of the sport by inducting her into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. And she will always be the first black player to win a singles major in tennis. Althea Gibson's story may have been very different if she hadn't been spotted at the age of 19 by Robert Johnson. Dr. Johnson was one of the first black physicians, setting up his medical practice in the town of Lynchburg, Virginia. His sporting prowess was best displayed as a highly proficient American football college player, but he was passionate about tennis, and just after the Second World War, Dr. J, as he was known, took the first steps towards establishing African Americans on the US tennis scene, as his grandson Lange Johnson explained in this speech in 2009.
One day, he decided to turn his passion for tennis into a cause that would be felt around the world. Dr. J came along at a time when a visionary was absolutely necessary in the sport. To be sure, he was a bit player in a much larger struggle to integrate the American society of the 1940s and 50s. Tennis was one front in that struggle where young Robert decided to see if he could move African Americans and tennis forward at the same time. The master plan was hatched in the summer of 1946 in Ohio. Dr. J and his good friend Dr. Hubert Eaton were watching the American Tennis Association's women's final, the African American equivalent to the United States Lawn Tennis Association. Althea Gibson, a raw 19-year-old, was in the midst of self-destructing against the steady, if unspectacular, Romania Peters. As the two men watched the match, Dr. J leaned over and said to his colleague, "I wish there was something we could do for that girl." They strategized from the stands, and as the match wore on and eventually wore out the frustrated Harlem resident, they decided they had a plan. At its conclusion, the two doctors approached Althea, and Dr. J asked, "How would you like to play at Forest Hills?"
By the time Gibson reached the gates of Forest Hills, a 12-year-old boy from Richmond, Virginia, had already arrived at Robert Johnson's tennis base in Lynchburg. Arthur Ashe became Johnson's next star pupil at the American Tennis Association's Junior Development Program, which Dr. J had founded to provide an all-expenses-paid camp for African-American children at a time when segregation meant black kids were not allowed to use public tennis facilities. Johnson became, in effect, the godfather of black tennis and was inducted posthumously into the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 2009. His induction speech was given by his grandson Lange, who set out what Johnson's camps meant for the likes of Ashe and the philosophy the doctor engendered.
Arthur nor any other kid in the program need worry about balls, rackets, hitting partners, or entry fees. All that was necessary to be part of this social experiment was to follow Dr. J's code of conduct, which, oddly enough, required perfection. No displays of emotion, period. Balls that were 2 inches out were suddenly in. In this new world, the misbehavior or perceived misbehavior of one could taint the group, taint the race, and those coming behind them. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad, he would always say. And those who made Dr. J mad by not following the program were not around very long. Arthur and dozens of other youth traveled together in a caravan of Buicks and Oldsmobiles, clothed in their tennis whites, while often being the only faces of color in tournaments in Greensboro, Knoxville, Little Rock, and Kalamazoo. This new world of integrated tennis that my grandfather helped forge shone a harsh spotlight on the African-American players who went through the cracks created by Arthur and Althea. The key mantra of my grandfather's life was, "It can be done." No integration in big-time tennis? It can be done. No state-of-the-art tennis facilities and equipment for African-American players? Absolutely can be done. If he were here today, my grandfather would survey the game, and he would be delighted as well as disappointed. He would reflect that besides the great Venus and Serena Williams, there have been too few great African-American players. But he wouldn't hold a press conference denouncing the fact because he was a visionary and a problem solver. He would begin by finding selfless tennis professionals and selling them on his vision, a vision of finding the best, most overlooked, and underserved talent, and providing these youth with a foundation for success in any endeavor they chose.
Robert Johnson died in 1971, and on his gravestone are the names of 3 tennis players, Gibson, Ashe, and his final star student, Juan Farrow, who, after being a promising national junior champion, went on to make a massive contribution to the development of tennis in Illinois, which would surely have pleased Dr. Johnson as much as individual singles successes. Of Robert Johnson's trio of players, the one with by far the greatest social impact was Arthur Ashe. And knowing Johnson's story and the way he educated black athletes in a segregationist climate, it's easy to see why Ashe took the low-key approach he did. His lawyer and manager, Donald Dell, recalls a meeting in 1968, not long after the assassination of the black civil rights leader Martin Luther King, when Ashe made clear the thinking behind his activism.
He was the kind of person that he didn't try to impress you. He wasn't trying to ever big time it. That was not Arthur. He was very quiet. He's very reflective. You know, he had a certain warmness about him, but you had to really know him, and you had to break through the communication. For example, I was in a meeting with him in '68. We were in the basement of Andy Young's home in Atlanta, and there were 30 black leaders down there. So this was after Martin Luther had been killed. And they were all talking about civil rights. And then suddenly, from the back of the room, and this has been well documented, back of the room, a voice from Jesse Jackson yells, "Hey, Brother Ashe, you know, you really have to talk more and be much more aggressive. You don't ever say anything about civil rights." And Arthur turned and said to him, he said, Jesse, I don't do it with my mouth. I do it with my racket. And that really was the way Arthur thought.
Ashe won the US Open in 1968, which amplified his wider influence. At the time, it wasn't just the USA that had segregation along race lines. In South Africa, the system known as apartheid enshrined in law that whites, blacks, and a category called coloureds, mostly people of Asian descent and mixed race, had to be kept apart in public places, including sports stadiums. Ashe wanted to see this for himself, but he wasn't sure whether to go. So he wrote to 10 people, 8 whites and 2 blacks, to sound out their opinion. One of the 2 black people he wrote to was Andrew Young, a congressman who was to become President Jimmy Carter's ambassador to the United Nations 3 years later.
I was one of the first ones that said, yeah, you by all means go. And Bob Green of Michigan State was the other black person he wrote. Both of us told him he ought to go. The white folk told him he should stay out of that. A letter that I wrote him when he said, should he go? I said, well, first of all, there's no prohibition. The boycott of sports had not started yet. And I said, you would do more with a tennis racket. I said, first place, tennis is a white man's sport. And if you go into South Africa in a white man's sport, and you're going to beat all these white people. He didn't win. Jimmy Connors won. But I think that was the reason he won Wimbledon the next year.
Partly because of a flippant comment Ashe had made about dropping a hydrogen bomb on Johannesburg, his first 3 attempts at getting a visa for South Africa were denied. On the 4th, he was successful, paving the way for him to make his bold visit there in 1973. Donald Dell told Yolanda Hester of the Arthur Ashe Oral History Project what happened behind the scenes when he met South Africa's sports minister.
Arthur was very important to him. He really wanted to go. So the 3rd year, I flew down there ahead of time and went to Pretoria and met the Minister of Interior and Sport. And so I said, Arthur would really like to come. Is there any chance of getting... He said, wait a minute. The South African government will give him a visa right now on one condition. And I said, what's the condition? And they said that while he's in the country, he can go anywhere he wants. He can see anybody he wants. He can talk to anybody, but he can't have a press conference and talk about politics. Politics is off the counter. He talks about sports, America, the weather, the beauty, the animals, anything he wants, tennis, anything he wants to talk about. But I don't want him in a press conference where somebody asks him about apartheid and he gets a speech. So if he's willing to come and not talk about politics, we'd love to have him. So I thought, Arthur's never going to do that. So I go in, I call Arthur the next day into New York, and he says, I accept. I want to come on that basis. And I said, Arthur, the blacks in South Africa are going to hate you. Think about that. He said, no, I don't care about that. I don't care what they think, because I want to see a culture and a society that does what I'm told they do. I got to see that, Donald. I can't even imagine that. So we put it in writing, and we flew into Jan Smuts Airport in Johannesburg. And he was there for about 2 weeks. He played the national championships. And he did do one thing that we didn't get any credit for because they didn't understand it. He integrated Ellis Park, which is where the matches were played. And he said, I'm not going to play anywhere where blacks have to sit here, Indians have to sit there, non-coloreds, whatever that means, have to sit there. And I won't play if that happens. And we straightened that out ahead of time, and they said, no, we'll integrate the stadium, which they did.
Was that the first time they ever integrated it?
Yes.
Wow.
For that, yes. And that was a big deal. Mm-hmm. But the only problem was the government didn't take down any of the signs. It was announced, and it was in the press, and it was in the papers. But most of the people that went to the tennis went to their normal seating arrangements. So you had, I'd say, half and half. So we did do that, and when we went everywhere, we went into Soweto to give a tennis clinic, and we gave a clinic for about an hour. And at the end of the exhibition, it was sort of normal. We would take questions and answers. We ended up in the corner with fencing on both sides to answer questions. And it was a large crowd in Soweto, had thousands of people. A lot of people went home, a lot of people stayed to talk to Arthur and ask questions. And that's what we were there for. And the questions started getting very aggressive and very angry a little bit. And so we were getting nervous because we were sort of trapped in this fencing of the tennis court. I mean, nothing happened, but people were mad that, they were angry that Arthur was there and never, if somebody would say, well, what do you think of apartheid? He'd say, well, I'm not here to talk about politics. He didn't say the government wouldn't. He'd just say, I'm not here to talk about politics. Well, that made people mad because he wouldn't know the background.
Another person who played a role in Ashe's trip to South Africa was the Johannesburg tournament director, Owen Williams. He helped smooth the way to Ashe getting his visa by having a bizarre meeting with South Africa's white supremacist Prime Minister, John Vorster.
I flew to Cape Town. I went into this office the size of a rugby field, and there was this B.J. Foster, the Lion of the North, man that stuck blacks away with no rhyme or reason for life, had stuck Mandela away for life. And Mr. Williams, why should I let Arthur Ashe in if he wants to drop a hydrogen bomb? And fortunately, I couldn't get a video, but I had a tape, and it illustrated the throwaway line. And he pulled out his right-hand drawer, and he said, I've got the same tape here. He said, I knew the answer. I knew it was not what he meant to say. He said, if I let Arthur Ashe into the country, do you guarantee, let's say, my safety? I said, Mr. Prime Minister, do you and Arthur Ashe think I'm God? He said, why? I said, Arthur wants me to guarantee his safety from you. You want me to guarantee your safety from Arthur. You can only think I'm God. He laughed. And the first time I've ever known the man laugh. He said, I'll think about it. We'll be in touch. I don't do the Boer dialect very well, but he said, Mr. Williams, we'll be in touch. Pete Corniff called me a week later. He said, it's on. The game's on. How are you going to manage it? Well, I called the president of our tennis union, white, 14 provinces, mostly Boer. I called Ben Franklin and he said, we've got to vote on this. He said, most of our tennis unions are Afrikaans. They will not vote on it. I said, Glenn, I've thought about that. We deal with them as an fait accompli. We go to the next board meeting, which happens to be 2 days from now, and you tell them, and I announce Arthur's visit the same day. And they're going to have to come into the open and vote no. Well, naturally, it went through as a 14-0 vote. So at least we had that one hurdle behind us. The press, the Afrikaans press, was my next worry. There was 50% of the country read Afrikaans newspapers. We didn't have television in those days. That's a story unto itself. South Africa didn't get television until 1975. So we had the Afrikaans press. So I called the Afrikaans press to my office to lunch. I used to be able to feed about 24 people in my office. And to the man, they were behind me. They said, this is the greatest thing ever for South Africa. I said, if you say it's great for South Africa, Arthur won't come. It's got to be just great for humankind. So they got the message. Anyhow, the press was behind me. I had the government behind me. And I just had to deal with, instead of having a press box that seated about 40 people, I had the world press descending on me. I had over 200 journalists apply from every tennis-playing country in the world.
It's worth looking at what Ashe was hoping to achieve through his visit. Although he wanted to see apartheid in the flesh for himself, he was well aware that the idea of a successful black man was alien to the black and coloured communities in South Africa. One schoolboy who was into tennis and had adopted Ashe as his idol, having seen him in a tennis magazine, was Mark Mathabane, who ended up finishing his education in America and becoming a writer. For him, Ashe's visit to South Africa was like a religious experience.
I started to ask around, who knows about this man? Who knows about... And it so happened that, people in Alexandra and in South Africa were following religiously anything that Black Americans did and excelled in. It was like, look what they can prove when given freedom and opportunity. So that's why these stories were just so, dear to them. And one of them happened to be Arthur Ashe's. And so I started to hear about the story of Ashe, and somebody gave me, I think it was a magazine, not tennis related, but a magazine where his background, from learning tennis, playing in Richmond, in tournaments where he'd win the tournament and have to go to the back to get his trophy, meeting Dr. Johnson, he's going to UCLA. I mean, it was a whole summary. And that became almost like my Bible. And then it was in the midst of that word reached us that Arthur had decided that he wanted to come to South Africa, and a visa had finally been given to him because he had repeatedly wanted to come, but the visa was denied. His coming was like, the coming of the Messiah, because it was front page, in all the papers. And the reason why I liken it to that, it's because, to see a free black man was something, almost miraculous. And so that's the nature of his coming that transcended tennis.
As well as giving clinics in dangerous townships such as the notorious Soweto, Ashe played the South African Open, getting to the singles final where he lost to Jimmy Connors. But he did win the doubles, partnering Tom Ocker, showing South Africa that black men can become champions and can play alongside white men as equals. At the airport on Ashe's way home, an activist gave Donald Dell's wife a newspaper with a request to hand it to Ashe on the plane. Inside the paper was a handwritten letter from Winnie Mandela, the wife of the imprisoned black nationalist leader Nelson Mandela. As Dell explains, the contents of that letter show just how bold Ashe had been to travel to apartheid South Africa.
The letter was scathing, saying, what did you ever come down here for? You're Uncle Tom, and just blasted him, saying, we're not happy you came. Don't think, I know you're leaving and we're glad you're leaving. I don't remember all the words, and worse than that, I don't remember where the letter went. Because Arthur kept records of everything, and I suspect he kept that letter. And Mandela was still in jail, and this was his wife. I mean, they were still married, and they were still very active. So what nobody understood was what Arthur always planned was, we then had like an 8 or 9 hour flight from Johannesburg to Kennedy. So we prepared a speech for when he landed in Kennedy at a press conference, which we had organized. And when we landed, honestly, there were about 500 press people in Kennedy Airport. And, we issued a statement as to why he had gone and why he couldn't talk about it. We explained the whole thing. And then he blasted South Africa for 20 minutes and took, said you have to go to see it, these people, he just did it in a beautiful fashion. Arthur was not a yeller. He wasn't a screamer, and never. But he did it very intellectually, and then he took questions, and you can imagine. So he got everything he wanted once he got out of the country.
Despite blasting South Africa on his return to New York, Ashe was invited back the following year. And he went, again losing in the final to Jimmy Connors. But this time he did get involved in politics. He went to the infamous Robben Island, where Mandela was imprisoned, and met the future president. 16 years later, shortly after Mandela had been freed, he sought out Ashe on his first visit to New York, and the two men met for a second time. Richard Evans was one of the two journalists on the 1973 trip with Ashe. He says there was something unique about him.
I think he's one of the most special people I've met. There's no one quite like Arthur, from where he came from, how he deported himself, how he handled the racism, how he fitted into a white world for a young black man out of Virginia. That's a very difficult thing to do, but he did it with style, and he was honest. Always he was honest about himself, about his surroundings, and he was a teacher. And that is why one of the most satisfying things about statues in America is that they put a statue, because there was a black mayor of Richmond at the time, they had this statue made and put it on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, which was lined with Confederate generals. And Arthur, who was already dead, must have been looking down, feeling a little uncomfortable with his company. But now, today, they've all been taken away. And the only person on Monument Avenue is Arthur Ashe, not just with his tennis racket, but with his children at his feet and his books, because he was a teacher.
Arthur Ashe died in 1993, having contracted the immune deficiency condition AIDS as a result of an infected blood transfusion following heart surgery. It was a tragically early death for a remarkable 49-year-old who still had so much to give. Some say he might even have had a successful career in politics. At least by then he'd been inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame, though when that happened in 1985, few could have realised just how much more Ashe's legacy would grow in the years after his premature passing.
That was Chris Bowers telling the story of three remarkable Hall of Famers who showed great boldness. And we're immensely grateful to the Center for Oral History Research at the University of California for making available the interviews with Donald Dell, Owen Williams, Mark Mathabane, and Andrew Young. The interviews were conducted by Yolanda Hester for the Arthur Ashe Oral History Project, an initiative of the Arthur Ashe Legacy at UCLA. Additional research for this podcast was also carried out by Joel Drucker. For more in this series, we invite you to go to tennisfame.com/podcast and choose from a wide selection of interviews and discussions involving the great names of tennis. Next time on the podcast, we'll continue to talk about Arthur Ashe's legacy. Hall of Famers Charlie Passerelle and Richard Evans will be joining me to talk about that impactful trip to South Africa and Arthur's lasting impact in the world of tennis and beyond. I'm Patrick McEnroe. Thanks for listening to the TennisWorthy podcast.